Team Fortress 2, being an early example of a games as a service, featured post-launch support that was unprecedented at the time. Every few months, new content would be added to the game, from new maps, game modes, cosmetics later on, of course. But no content was as coveted as the new weapon. With Team Fortress 2's 9 distinct classes, there was already a decent amount of playstyle variety to be found throughout the game, but a new weapon can expand that variety even further, and maybe even turn your opinion around on a class you thought you didn't even like playing. Every new addition to the game risks disrupting the balance, however, and to suggest that Valve, throughout their decade-long support of TF2, never had this happen would be foolish. Revisionist, even. No, there were plenty of times Valve introduced unbalanced weapons to the game, which resulted in turmoil amongst the community, until things inevitably got reined in. After a while, anyway. Welcome to Fallen Loadouts. In this series, I intend to take a look at loadouts that were the cream of the crop once upon a time, discuss them at their peak, their downfall, how they fare today, and their closest iteration in the current build of Team Fortress 2. 2010 saw the release of the Man-Economy update for Team Fortress 2. Hatmania had already had its talons in the game by this point, but this update would cement the first-person shooter's reputation as a war-themed hat simulator by introducing the in-game cash shop and prototype loot box Manco supply crate. For many, this was when the game jumped the shark, and considering the state of the AAA game industry today, they were probably right to say that Team Fortress 2 shouldn't have opened this proverbial Pandora's supply crate. But fans who stuck around were given a front row seat to a new suite of weapons for several of the classes. These weapons served as a litmus test for a new idea the TF2 team was experimenting with. Players who equipped all of the weapons alongside the accompanying hat sold exclusively at the Manco Store TM, would receive an additional bonus to further augment their play. Soldiers who used the full Tank Buster set got a damage resistance to Engineer Sentry Guns. Special Delivery Scouts got an extra health boost that gave them HP on par with the medics. Snipers who rocked the full Croc-O style kit got the infuriatingly hilarious perk of surviving any headshot with 1 HP. And the Pyro's weapon set, the Gas Jockey's kit, required both their flamethrower and melee slot, as well as the in-theme hat, to receive its bonus of a 10% faster movement speed. Which would be pretty good, however it was curbed a tad by also giving its wielder a 10% increased bullet vulnerability. These item set bonuses weren't very popular with the community, and according to Valve were a nightmare to balance, so they got removed from the game about 3 years later. But it's worth dissecting why these were added to the game to begin with. The obvious answer is a cynical attempt at encouraging the player base to open their coffers and pay $7.50 for the shiny new items and hats, but if we examine it a little closer, it's clear that from a game design perspective, it's to encourage you to use all of the items in a set. These items were meant to synergize with each other, but a lot of them really didn't, and if they did, they resulted in a heavily gimped playstyle. The black box, for example, wasn't, and still isn't, very good at destroying sentry guns since its clip size is smaller. The Croc-O style kit let a sniper survive headshots at the cost of literally everything else that made the class powerful. And the Gas Jockey's kit, while interesting, required that you run the power jack in your melee slot, when the ideal melee weapon for Pyro was waiting in the wings. Because the Gas Jockey's flamethrower, the degreaser, was the lubricant a burgeoning playstyle needed to come fully online. The degreaser gave its user a 65% faster weapon switch speed, meaning Pyros could switch to either their secondary or melee weapons with lightning fast speeds. You could use the power jack for this combo, there was nothing really wrong with it in a vacuum. It dealt more damage than the default Pyro melee and even gave extra HP on kill. But any other Pyro melee was playing second fiddle to the Axtinguisher, a melee weapon released a few years earlier in the Pyro update. The Pyro update was a major patch for the game meant to rebalance and improve the titular class from its launch state. Launch Pyro was probably the class most deserving of a rework. Their role as a skirmish/ambush class was not properly realized due to the class's poor mobility, range, and survivability. This update, while only arguably addressing that role, did give the class some helpful new unlocks that would inform the design of the class for the rest of the game's active development. The Manconomy update being no exception. The melee weapon introduced in the Pyro update was the Axtinguisher, a melee weapon that could deal a devastating 195 damage on burning players. To put that into perspective, 195 damage is enough to one-shot 7 of the 9 classes at full HP. In practice though, it's more like 8, since the burn damage required to deal the Axtinguisher crit would likely be enough to one-shot a full HP soldier. Now, this was extremely powerful, but it wasn't decried on release, since Pyros had some tough hurdles to cross before they could deal that delicious crit. Switching from the flamethrower to the Axtinguisher was pretty slow, and getting an axe swing on an enemy would be easier said than done a lot of the time because of that. Not to mention, melee hit detection in Team Fortress 2 feels like a dice roll a lot of the time. But it was usually worth it for the Pyros to try their luck, and now with the Degreaser, the odds were never more in their favor. With the Manconomy update, the strategy of burning a player, switching to the Axtinguisher, and dealing a meaty crit was made viable. This strategy became so popular it got a nickname, Puff and Sting, and it would be the major strategy for the Combo Pyro. The Combo Pyro strategy was truly unique at the time, since this was the earliest and one of the only examples of a class's primary weapon being used more as a support role than the main damage dealer. That being said, Combo Pyro absolutely does not reach the same heights without the help of the Degreaser. Ever tried the Combo Pyro strategy with stock? Feels like wearing lead boots. So the Degreaser's primary weapon role remains in Spirit, despite most Pyros dealing more damage with their melee or secondary slots. Let's examine their secondary while we're at it, because a 2010 Combo Pyro usually stuck to one singular choice for that slot, and that choice was the Flare Gun. An unlock that was added in the same update as the Axtinguisher, it fired a projectile that dealt a low amount of base damage but set enemies on fire. It was a decent option meant to address the Pyro's poor range, but on release would only really function as a harassment tool rather than a true threat. It wouldn't be until an update a few months prior to the Manconomy update where it received a major boost in power. It was given the Axtinguisher treatment, dealing critical damage on burning players. A critical flare wasn't nearly as strong as an Axtinguisher crit, 90 damage versus 195, but the range increase made it a premier choice for Combo Pyro. Much like Puff and Sting, burning an enemy with a flamethrower, then following up with a flare gun crit would become known as flare punching. Savvy Pyros also quickly realized that they could incorporate the flamethrower's air blast into the strategy. The air blast is an alt fire most flamethrowers can do that'll extinguish teammates, reflect enemy projectiles, and most importantly, send enemies flying in a fixed direction towards wherever the Pyro is facing. If the Pyro got an enemy in close quarters with this move, it was very hard to get out of the impending Axtinguisher crit. This strategy could be considered pretty oppressive at this point, but it wasn't completely bulletproof. Combo Pyro had the same weakness regular Pyro had since day one: terrible long-range damage potential. If they can't get the combo off, they're screwed. The flare gun might have a long range, but it's not as if flare punching is a viable strategy from across the two fort battlements or anything. It was a strategy with clear weaknesses, but when it was on top, it was incredible, and it still wasn't even at full power. When the Uber update dropped, Pyro was one of the only classes to not get a full item set, instead having to settle for a flare gun unlock more meant as a mobility tool. The detonator wasn't a bad weapon in its own right, but there was a bit of sour grapes at the time over a soldier unlock released in that update. The reserve shooter was a shotgun for the soldier that increased weapon switch speed by 15% and dealt mini crit damage to airborne enemies at the cost of 3 shells from the clip size. The strategy for the weapon was obvious: knock enemies airborne with the rocket launcher, then switch to the reserve shooter to get some meaty damage in before they touch the ground. But there was another class that could reliably send enemies airborne that also equipped the shotgun. So some members of the community began asking for Valve to give the shotgun to the Pyro. To be honest, I don't know exactly where this movement began. Old discussion boards such as Facepunch and the Steam-powered user forums are long gone, but regardless, this choir of voices eventually made their way to Valve, as a little over a year after Combo Pyro turned online, the Maniversary update was released, and one of the undocumented changes saw Valve handing the Pyro the reserve shooter.
Move on to the Pyro and see if we can get something to happen with the Pyro. Oh, nice black screen. So now, take a look at this. The reserve shooter, you can now use it on the Pyro. Very, very cool. So let's see. I'm going to use the degreaser to get the fast switch. So essentially, what you want to try and do is you want to blast somebody in the air, switch over real quick, and get the mini crits. I am going to love this, guys, because if you know how I...
This action made a lot of people very angry and was widely considered to be a bad move. Over a decade after the decision was made, I think it's clear that giving the reserve shooter to Pyro was a knee-jerk balance change that should have never happened. On Soldier, it was arguably a little underpowered, since sending enemies airborne with your rocket launcher can be a little unreliable. But on Pyro, launching an enemy airborne is as simple as clicking mouse 2. The air blast at the time sent enemies at a fixed trajectory. A half-decent Pyro would always know where their target was gonna fly, and pop them with some nigh-effortless mini-crit shotgun blasts. It's also worth mentioning that at the time, the reserve shooter dealt mini-crits to any airborne enemy in general, meaning that just jumping was a suboptimal move versus Combo Pyro. Finding yourself up against a Combo Pyro at this point in the game's life was a very scary position. Of course there were ways to counter them, but many times losing to one made me personally feel dumbfounded on what had even happened. This oppressive loadout took a long time to be addressed by Valve. Almost 3 full years would pass before anything in the Combo Pyro playstyle would be rebalanced. Maybe that might lead you to believe the community thought the loadout was fine, and you'd be... well, actually, you'd be right. There wasn't that much of a fervor in the community over this loadout at the time, despite me raving about its power. I can think of a few reasons for why that was, and surprisingly, none of them have to do with me being wrong about this loadout being too strong. For one, it boosted Pyro's power, especially in pubs. Pyro was well known for being a pretty weak class, and a lot of folks considered the combo playstyle to be Valve putting their thumb on the scale. It also helped that Puff and Sting, or rather Combo Pyro as a whole, was actually a pretty fun and unique playstyle for the class. It was fun to deal tremendous burst damage in record time by swapping between all of the Pyro's weapons. There's also the fact that it was more skill intensive than practically any other playstyle the class had to offer. When it came to the likes of the Tommy Groovich, that was basically just a heavy playstyle but overclocked. Combo Pyro was far from the likes of WM1. Which leads me to my final reason. Now, bear with me, because I might come across as conspiratorial here, but I think the real reason Combo Pyro was left untouched for so long was because the community as a whole had much more of an axe to grind against the actual premier Pyro playstyle, WM1. WM1 as a playstyle is fairly easy to explain even if you've never played TF2 once in your life and are, for some reason, still watching this video. Hi Megan. The playstyle refers to the W key on a keyboard, which is mapped to moving forward in TF2, and the M1 standing for mouse 1, aka left click on your mouse, aka shooting your flames button. When put together, it portrays a deceptively simple strategy. Walk forward and hold down the fire button, sending out a constant stream of flames. I assure you, that is all there is to the strategy, and it drives a lot of people up the fucking wall, because it is the natural instinct for practically any Pyro noob to employ this strategy, and occasionally they'll be rewarded with a few kills for playing the class this way. Some might argue that while max power Combo Pyro could be strong in certain situations, it felt better to lose to the likes of that than the player with less than 10 hours who somehow managed to run through your whole team spraying gasoline so inconsiderately the brain dead strategy wrapped around to being next level genius. Kinda like how some people would prefer to lose to a player doing a perfect string of moves rather than the scrub who spammed grab over and over and eke out a win. WM1 can be an effective strategy, but its skill ceiling and floor are lower than Combo Pyro's. It especially doesn't help that the poster child weapon for WM1 is widely considered to be the most frustrating, annoying, overpowered, bullshit weapon in the entire game. People to this day complain about the strategy, so that's why I'm gonna ask you all to hear me out when I say that I think WM1 gets a little more heat than it deserves. This may seem a little harsh, but I think if you find yourself losing to a WM1 Pyro often, you need to re-examine who is the one at fault here. It's a low skill playstyle, and I understand that it can be annoying to lose to it on occasion, but I also believe it's earned its keep as a very beginner friendly strategy that gives new players a foothold in an otherwise daunting game with all sorts of different classes and abilities. I'd argue WM1 actually working sometimes is necessary for those players. If I may be anecdotal for a moment, when I first started playing Team Fortress 2 back in 2011, I played a lot of Pyro. They're still my third most played class even. One of the earliest memories I have with this game was a time on Hoodoo where I popped out in front of the cart, held down W, and took out several players using my flamethrower, holding mouse 1. Getting all of those frags felt so great afterward. All of this isn't to say that you shouldn't get frustrated over WM1 because it can be frustrating, or that Combo Pyro needed to get nerfed because it wasn't the intended way for the class to be played, because who cares if it wasn't? I'm simply putting forward the idea that perhaps Combo Pyro went unchecked for so long because the WM1 playstyle took a majority of the heat from the community. Combo Pyro's full power might have lasted a long time, but it was eventually checked. And this upcoming update would be the first warning shot for the playstyle. The Love and War update of 2014 is pretty well known throughout the community for its nerfs of both miniguns and sticky bomb launchers, but one nerf that goes forgotten is the Axtinguishers. In this update, the weapon was changed to only deal critical damage when attacking the enemy's back. Otherwise, the weapon would deal mini-crit damage. I believe the idea here was to promote a flanking playstyle instead of just air blasting enemies into a corner and critting them. It's a nice thought, but I don't think this was a good change, because it made a finicky weapon even finickier. Melee hit detection already provides a bit of friction for the Puff and Sting combo, so adding the notoriously unreliable layer of the backstab detection to the weapon felt like a bad idea. Not to mention, if a Pyro was in a position where they see a player's backside, chances are they already have the drop on them and can just burn them to death with the flamethrower. It didn't seem like Valve was very satisfied with this Axtinguisher nerf either, because they'd return with a rework of the weapon with the Tough Break update of December 2015. And this update is the reason I believe nobody talks about the Love and War Axtinguisher nerf, because this is the update that took the weapon back behind the barn. The Axtinguisher regained its crit on burning enemies trait, but gained a universal damage penalty of 33%. Meaning that an Axtinguisher swing would be dealing around 130 damage at full power. Still a decent chunk of damage, but a far cry from its original iteration. If that wasn't bad enough, its swing and deploy speeds were decreased by 20% and 75% respectively. The weapon just felt way more sluggish to use, and even with the universal increase in weapon switch speed that was added in the same update, pairing the Axtinguisher with the Degreaser wouldn't give you that lightning fast deploy time anymore. Especially since the Degreaser also got a nerf. Instead of a general increase in weapon switch speed, switching from the Degreaser would only be 30% faster instead of the original 65%. That speed was somewhat retained, but only when switching to the flamethrower. I know I just threw a lot of percents at you, so if you're confused, just think of these changes like Puff and Sting getting an iron ball and chain attached to its legs. The Degreaser got additional nerfs, like an increased air blast cost and afterburn damage penalty, things that affected the potency of the weapon itself rather than the combo aspects of the weapon. If we're being honest, they're penalties the weapon probably should have had in the first place, as its downsides prior were fairly meaningless. What's strange about these nerfs is it's not exactly the complete execution of the Combo Pyro playstyle that it may appear to be at first. The reserve shooter was mostly untouched through this update, though still living off the high of its clip size buff a few years ago. That happened, by the way. It only lost the benefit to mini-crit jumping enemies. Flare punching was a little slower because of the degreaser nerf, but Pyros could still stunlock enemies with air blasts, provided they didn't spam the move. The biggest change to combo Pyro was, unsurprisingly, the Axtinguisher nerf. While it could still put up decent numbers, it was so slow and cumbersome to use, it opened the door for the Power Jack, the degreaser's sibling melee, to take the spot as top tier Pyro melee. The Power Jack was a more support-oriented choice, because since 2013 it had been given the Gas Jockey speed bonus and damage vulnerabilities while active. The overall power of the loadout was weakened, but it wasn't destroyed beyond repair. What separates the combo Pyro loadout from the likes of other problem loadouts is its versatility. There were several variants to the playstyle, so even with hits as strong as the aforementioned Axtinguisher nerfs, it never really resulted in a definitive death blow. But this also meant that once the playstyle started getting nerfs, they kept coming update after update. The next major nerf to Combo Pyro's playstyle would come in the Jungle Inferno update in late 2017. This update was focused around reworking and improving the Pyro class, ironically. These reworks involved a total overhaul of the flamethrower's air blast. The former design of an AoE stunlock was gone. From this point onward, the knockback it dealt was much more positionally dependent. This is the version that modern day Pyros use, and it's a much better iteration on the idea than the one cooked up in 2008, even if it does have some quirks. This was only technically a nerf to the Puff and Sting playstyle, as it was harder to stunlock enemies now. The real definitive nerf to the playstyle was given to the reserve shooter, which would no longer mini-crit enemies knocked airborne via the air blast. Quote, Pyros are too easily able to take advantage of this weapon's primary feature via air blast, i.e. no penalty, on-demand launching of their target. And so their damage potential can greatly exceed that of the other classes that can also use this weapon. End quote. Couldn't have said it better myself, Valve. My only wish is that this nerf had happened sooner, instead of a whole 6 years after the Pyro was given the gun to begin with. The Pyro's original Fire Axe unlock would receive a buff in the final rebalance update in March of 2018. The speed of the Axtinguisher was restored, and it was also given a speed boost on kill ability at the bequest of some guy who pretended he died of cancer. Long story. Anyway, these changes were given hand in hand with the crits on burning player attribute being reduced to mini crits yet again, although this time it had a twist. It dealt additional damage depending on how much afterburn time remained on the enemy. This was to encourage Pyros to burn enemies longer with their flamethrower instead of just hitting them with one flame particle and switching to the axe as soon as possible. Since the amount of afterburn on an enemy was dependent on how long a Pyro was burning them for as of the then new Jungle Inferno update. This is the final version of the Axtinguisher, and while it's certainly in a better spot than it was post Tough Break, it's a far cry from its original iteration. Its design I would describe as both a little paradoxical and a little unreliable. Unreliable because of the variable damage. It's no longer easy to tell how much damage the Axtinguisher swings will do. And if the swing doesn't end up killing, the Pyro is in a pretty compromised position. Paradoxical because to get the maximum amount of damage from the axe, the Pyro wants to burn enemies more with the flamethrower. So to a certain extent, they might have been better off simply WM1ing the whole way. There are still moments where its former glory shines through, but they're fewer and farther between. The weapon is in a decent spot, but the ground it stands on is shaky. With this change to the Axtinguisher, we have reached the current version of the Combo Pyro loadout. So what does the ideal version of it look like in today's Team Fortress 2? I think there's a few different paths to take the Combo Pyro loadout, but all of them have a constant in the degreaser. Even though it's not at its apex and hasn't been in almost a decade, it's still the linchpin for the strategy. It wasn't ever nerfed into the ground or completely reworked to the point that it's irrelevant to the loadout. It's just slightly worse at switching to the Pyro's combo finishers. Speaking of slightly worse, the Axtinguisher has a place in the Combo Pyro playstyle too, although its role is way less over-centralizing. The Power Jack, as mentioned earlier, has a legit claim as the best Pyro melee these days, especially if you're confident with your secondary aim and you think you can sacrifice the damage potential of your melee. The back scratcher's overall increased damage might entice some, but I'd only recommend it if you want a pale imitation of the Love and War's Axtinguisher. It's not a bad melee, but it's not at its best as an ingredient of Puff and Sting. And before anyone recommends it, no, the Neon Annihilator is not a valid replacement for the likes of the Axtinguisher. The standard equip for Combo Pyro secondary was, and still is, the Flare Gun. Over the years of rebalances, the Flare Gun has remained the Loadout's trusty sidearm, even if it was overshadowed somewhat by a certain shotgun. It's a far cry from the max power of the Axtinguisher, but no class save for the heavy can easily shrug off a flare punch to the gut. Other flare guns like the Detonator and Scorch Shot don't deal nearly as much direct damage, instead choosing to focus on movement and harassment respectively. I wouldn't say neither belong on a Combo Pyro loadout, since in the right hands the Detonator can lead to some pretty sick kills. It was also the weapon of choice for a certain alive and well Pyro main, and the hatred you'll accrue when using the Scorch Shot can invoke the same rage you would have gotten had you used the old iteration of the Reserve Shooter. Speaking of, I don't think the Reserve Shooter belongs on the Combo Pyro loadout anymore. It's technically still possible to get the mini crit damage while playing as Pyro, but the conditions are so specific it's not worth giving up 2 shells in the clip. The stock shotgun stands head and shoulders above the Reserve Shooter these days as a consistent, class-agnostic damage dealer. Although, if you wanted to be a little quirky, you could try out the Panic Attack. It's a shotgun that gets overlooked quite a bit, but with its 50% faster deploy speed, you can somewhat relive the glory days of the old degreaser Reserve Shooter loadout, just without any of the cheese. It might still be a bit of a rogue pick, but definitely worth considering. The Combo Pyro playstyle had a turbulent couple of years rebalance-wise, but currently I would consider it a decent, albeit inconsistent playstyle. Basically every tool the playstyle uses was smacked with the Nerf bat at some point over the years, and while some of the tools managed to recover or pivot, they all lost a little something. The degreaser's once blisteringly fast universal switch speed was changed to a slightly faster switch speed that crumbles under the weight of TF2 spaghetti code and occasionally doesn't work. The Air Blast doesn't send enemies at a consistent arc anymore and is dependent on the specific angle the Pyro is aiming, making flare punches harder to aim. Fuck the Reserve Shooter. And the Axtinguisher turned from reliable to unreliable, sometimes not securing the damage for a Puff and Sting kill. As much as I disliked losing to this playstyle in the past, I do wonder if all of the nerfs doled out to this playstyle over the years ended up being too much. The Reserve Shooter definitely needed to go, and Air Blast certainly shouldn't have stayed a stun lock. But both the Degreaser and the Axtinguisher being in their current stage makes the backbone of the Combo Pyro loadout feel much less elegant than the glory days of the Obama administration. I do, to an extent, sympathize with Pyro mains that lament the current state of the loadout. But if I may offer a silver lining, it's that the variation in playstyles for the class have never been less centralized. Combo Pyro is still a decent strategy, but so is the likes of the Dragon's Fury, a relatively new flamethrower that has a much higher skill floor and ceiling, something the slot had been needing for years. Stock Flamethrower and the Backburner can put up some pretty scary damage numbers, especially if the Pyro catches their enemies off guard with mobility weapons like the Detonator or Thermal Thruster. The Phlogistinator is evil. The class might be on the lower side of the balancing scale, but at the very least, there's some variety amongst their weapons, which is more than you can say for some other classes.